Orphaned before she could even speak, Catherine de' Medici entered the world with nothing but a name and the weight of destiny pressing down on her. From the darkness of her tragic beginnings, she rose, navigating a world of power, betrayal, and heartbreak. A queen, not by birthright, but by sheer will. Her survival depended on political cunning, and her heart was torn by a ruthless game of love and loss. In the courts of France, she would fight against the shadows of her past, the enemies at her doorstep, and the ruthless ambition that defined her. Was she a queen? Or was she a woman whose own ambition trapped her in a web of sacrifice, betrayal, and bloodshed? This is the story of Catherine de' Medici, the Black Queen of France. Catherine de' Medici was born on April 13, 1519, in the grand city of Florence, under the shadow of a powerful family legacy. But from the very start, her life would be one defined by loss and abandonment. Her father, Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, and her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, Countess of Boulogne, were both figures of considerable stature, yet neither would live long enough to offer Catherine the love and protection that a child desperately needs. Her father died just a few months after her birth, and her mother succumbed to complications shortly after. By the time Catherine was a few months old, she had already lost both of her parents, an experience that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Orphaned and abandoned by her birth parents, Catherine was left with only the name of one of Italy's most powerful families to guide her. Yet, the Medici name, while powerful, could offer little solace to a newborn child, left without the familial bonds that should have been her birthright. Florence, a city brimming with wealth and influence, was still an indifferent place for an orphaned princess. Though she would grow up in the Medici household, surrounded by the grandiose wealth and culture of the Italian Renaissance, the absence of parental love was a shadow that would never quite leave her. The emotional toll of this loss would manifest throughout Catherine's early years. A child is meant to be cradled in the warmth of their mother's embrace, yet Catherine would never know such comfort. This early loss shaped her psyche, creating an unshakable fear of abandonment. Her heart, though young, learned early that the world was not a place where safety was guaranteed. Instead, it was a battleground where only the strongest survived and where family ties were fragile at best. As Catherine grew, her isolation was compounded by the indifference of the world around her. She was constantly reminded that her parents' death had left her vulnerable, exposed to the whims of those who saw her not as a beloved child, but as a tool to be used for political gain. The absence of maternal love, the cruel fate that had torn her from the safety of her mother's arms, shaped her into someone who would fight for every scrap of affection and security she could find. Yet, for much of her youth, Catherine could only look on as others moved through life with the security of family, while she remained an outsider. Following the death of her parents, Catherine was taken in by the powerful Medici family, who were at the heart of Florence's political and cultural life. The Medici household, led by her uncle, Pope Leo X, and later by his successor, Pope Clement VII, was filled with intrigue, wealth, and power. But for Catherine, being a part of this prestigious family came with its own set of challenges. She was raised alongside the Medici children, yet always remained an outsider in their eyes, a foreign princess from a family now gone. Though Catherine was surrounded by luxury and fine art, her formative years were not marked by love or familial warmth. The Medici family, embroiled in their own political machinations, had little time for an orphaned niece who had no power to offer them. Her life with them was often one of loneliness. She was taught the ways of the court, the dances, the languages, the games of politics. But there was always a sense that she didn't truly belong. The children of the Medici family had their own close bonds, but Catherine remained in the shadows, her identity shaped not by affection, but by duty and survival. The court of Florence, while grand, was also one of fierce competition. Amongst the power struggles, Catherine's status was uncertain. Her beauty, though noted, was not enough to secure her place in the world. Her Medici relatives were embroiled in their own struggles, and Catherine's future was anything but certain. There were constant reminders that she was an outsider, someone who had to earn her place in a world that was indifferent to her existence. For Catherine, the Medici family, for all their power and status, were just another reminder that she was alone. Despite the lack of emotional connection, Catherine began to learn the ways of court politics early. The Medici family was involved in constant political intrigue, and Catherine was raised amidst this chaos. From a young age, she was exposed to the complex games of power and survival that defined Renaissance Italy. In her eyes, power was not just something that was handed down by birthright. It was something that had to be earned through alliances, cunning, and sometimes betrayal. It was here that Catherine learned how to navigate the dangerous world of court politics, and began to realize that she would have to rely on her mind, not just her beauty, to survive. Catherine's early life with the Medici family was a crucible that forged her into a politically astute woman. Despite the isolation she often felt, she learned how to blend into the powerful world around her, how to use the systems in place for her advantage. She would never be the most loved or cherished member of the Medici family, but she would learn to be a master of the game that kept them all in power. In this world, survival was everything, and Catherine began to understand that the key to her survival lay in her ability to control her environment, not to be controlled by it. Throughout her youth, she was passed over for marriages that could secure her position in the royal family, a painful reminder that in the ruthless world of European court politics, her value was determined by her ability to form advantageous alliances. In a time when women had little power outside of marriage, Catherine's future depended on her ability to secure a politically advantageous match. Yet, despite her beauty, she found herself passed over time and again in favor of more powerful, more influential families. The sting of being overlooked was something Catherine would carry with her throughout her life, but it was also a lesson in survival. She learned quickly that to thrive in the political world, she needed more than just beauty. She needed intelligence, cunning, and the ability to manipulate the forces around her. As Catherine faced rejection after rejection, she grew increasingly determined not to let her beauty be the only thing that defined her. In the courts of Europe, women like her were often little more than political tools, and Catherine knew she would need to carve out a space for herself that went beyond her appearance. Her beauty was her first weapon, but it would not be her last. Slowly, Catherine began to realize that her real strength lay in her mind, the ability to read people, to outmaneuver her rivals, and to find ways to gain power even when it seemed out of reach. Despite these setbacks, Catherine's resilience only grew stronger. She began to develop a sharp political mind, learning to navigate the dangerous world of European politics with caution and precision. She knew that power would not come easily, but she also knew that she could not afford to be passive. She would have to fight for it, one step, one marriage, one alliance at a time. The Medici family, despite their wealth and influence, was constantly embroiled in political chaos. Florence, under their rule, was a city torn between factions, where power was constantly in flux. Catherine grew up in this turbulent environment, witnessing firsthand the instability that even the most powerful families could face. The political landscape was a battlefield, and Catherine was keenly aware that she would need more than just beauty to survive. The Medici family's internal struggles, compounded by external enemies, created a volatile environment that shaped Catherine's view of the world. The political chaos surrounding the Medici family during Catherine's youth also exposed her to the realities of court life. The Medici were not just wealthy merchants, they were political players, constantly vying for control and survival. Catherine watched as her relatives struggled to maintain their power, using alliances, marriages, and backstabbing to secure their futures. In this world, betrayal was a constant threat, and loyalty was fleeting. Catherine began to understand that in such a world, survival meant having a finger on the pulse of every shift in power, every change in alliance. Though Catherine was not yet an active player in the Medici family's political game, she learned valuable lessons during this period. She watched how her family navigated crises, how alliances were formed and broken, and how quickly fortunes could change. For Catherine, these years were a master class in the art of political survival. She learned how to play the game, how to move through the court with caution, how to keep her enemies close, and how to always keep one step ahead of the changing tides. The instability of the Medici rule would have lasting consequences for Catherine. The family's struggle for control over Florence led to several dramatic events, including the eventual exile of some of its most powerful members. This chaotic environment taught Catherine that she could not rely on anyone for protection or support. She would need to create her own power base. The Medici family, for all their wealth and influence, were not immune to the perils of political instability, and Catherine learned that lesson well. By the time she reached adulthood, Catherine understood that power in Europe was not something that could be inherited or passed down. It was something that had to be fought for, earned, and held on to. Her early exposure to the Medici family's struggles shaped her into a woman who knew how to navigate the intricacies of power, and who understood that nothing was ever guaranteed in the dangerous world of court politics. Catherine's marriage to Henry II of France, arranged when she was just 14, marked the beginning of her royal life. It was not a marriage born of love, but rather of political necessity. The French court had an interest in solidifying an alliance with the Medici family, and Catherine was the pawn who would make that happen. As a young girl, Catherine had little say in the matter. She was sent to France to marry a man who was already promised to another, and who had little interest in her. Despite the lack of affection from her husband, Catherine's marriage was the gateway to her future power. It was through Henry that Catherine would eventually gain the title of Queen Consort, and through her sons that she would come to control the throne of France. But Catherine was not simply a passive observer in this marriage. She quickly learned that to survive, she would have to take an active role in securing her place. Marital struggles and the quest for power. The mistress of the king, Diane de Poitiers. From the moment Catherine de Medici stepped into the French court, she was met with a cold and humiliating reality. Her husband, Henri, the Dauphin of France, was deeply devoted to another woman, his longtime mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Diane was 20 years older than Henry and had been part of his life since his youth. She was elegant, confident, and held considerable influence over him. Even as Catherine took her rightful place beside Henry, it was Diane who controlled his heart, his attention, and much of his trust. This dynamic left Catherine sidelined in her own marriage, publicly dishonored before the eyes of the court. The French court buzzed with whispers, many mocking Catherine's lack of influence over her husband. Diane wasn't just a lover, she was a political force. She received gifts meant for the queen, resided in royal palaces, and had her initials entwined with Henry's on official emblems. The court knew where true power lay, and it wasn't with the young Italian-born queen. Catherine, humiliated but not defeated, observed in silence. While she smiled at ceremonies and played the obedient wife in public, her heart harbored a growing resentment, and her mind began quietly strategizing her future. Henry's blind devotion to Diane was more than a personal insult. It was a political obstacle. Every opportunity that should have come to Catherine as queen consort was often redirected to Diane. Diplomats paid homage to the mistress before speaking to the queen. Nobles aligned themselves with Diane to curry favor with the king. Catherine understood that she was being erased not just emotionally, but institutionally. This was not just about a woman scorned. This was about a queen without power. Still, Catherine remained composed. She never lashed out publicly. She never exposed her bitterness. She knew how the game was played. While Diane basked in the king's affection, Catherine started gathering influence in quieter places, among ladies-in-waiting, servants, and low-level courtiers who respected her dignity. She began building loyalty one relationship at a time, knowing that power did not always come from public approval. Sometimes it came from silent, steady endurance. Her emotional pain, however, was real. Catherine was a woman who desired love, and despite the political nature of their union, she had hoped for at least some affection from her husband. But night after night, she watched as Henry gave himself to another woman, while she lay alone in her chambers. The sting of jealousy was made worse by the laughter and gossip of the court. Catherine bore the humiliation not just as a queen, but as a woman whose heart had been shut out. Infertility and the pressure for an heir. The early years of Catherine's marriage were not only filled with emotional isolation, but also political desperation. For 10 long years, Catherine failed to conceive a child. In a royal court where a queen's primary duty was to produce heirs, her infertility became a matter of public concern and private shame. Whispers spread like wildfire, questioning her worth and even her womanhood. Some blamed her heritage, others accused her of being cursed. Every month that passed without news of pregnancy tightened the noose around her position. The pressure came not only from the nobility, but from Henry himself. Though he remained outwardly patient, encouraged by Diane de Poitiers, the reality was that Catherine's inability to provide an heir jeopardized the stability of the Valois line. France could not afford a queen who could not secure the dynasty. Doctors were consulted, strange remedies were suggested, and prayers were whispered in candlelit chapels. Still, Catherine remained childless, and with each passing year, the threat of annulment loomed larger. Desperate, Catherine subjected herself to humiliating and often dangerous fertility treatments. From herbal concoctions to animal-based potions, she tried everything. One of the most disturbing records describes her use of cow dung and powdered stag antlers in hopes of stimulating fertility, a measure not of faith in the medicine, but of her sheer desperation. She suffered these indignities in silence, knowing that her failure was more than personal. It was political. If she were dismissed as queen, she would lose everything. Her enemies began circling. Powerful families whispered of replacing her with a fertile wife who could give Henry sons. The idea of exile or forced retirement to a convent was not beyond imagination. Catherine was constantly aware of the precariousness of her situation. She clung to what little dignity she had left, even as the court grew colder toward her. In these moments of fear and humiliation, a hardened resolve began to form beneath her calm exterior. It was during this time that Catherine began to truly transform. The pain and shame did not break her, they forged her. She learned to mask her anxiety, to absorb insults without response, and to calculate every move with precision. She began cultivating relationships with those who might protect her position. Her eyes missed nothing, and her silence was no longer born from submission. It was the silence of a woman learning to survive. After a decade of waiting and endless doubt, Catherine's prayers were finally answered. In 1544, she gave birth to a son, Francis, the future king of France. The entire court exhaled with relief. The birth of an heir secured the Valois line and saved Catherine's crown. For the first time, she stood in a position of power that no one could deny. Her womb, once scorned, was now celebrated. France had a dauphin, and Catherine had her place. The birth of Francis was followed by a stream of children, 9 in total, with 7 surviving infancy. Catherine, once viewed as barren and replaceable, now held the future of the monarchy in her hands. She had become the mother of kings and queens, and the court could no longer ignore her presence. Her status transformed almost overnight. Those who had once dismissed her now sought her favor. The same nobles who had laughed behind her back now bowed in her presence. But motherhood was not simply a personal victory for Catherine. It was the gateway to deeper political involvement. With each child born, she became more entrenched in the machinery of power. She personally oversaw their education, alliances, and court behavior. Her sons were not just her children, they were her political assets. She began to understand that her legacy would not be carved by her husband, but by the children she bore and the decisions she helped shape. Still, the joy was not without its complications. Catherine's relationship with Diane de Poitiers remained strained. Though she had delivered the heir that Diane could not, the mistress still held Henry's affection. Catherine endured this ongoing humiliation with the knowledge that power would come to her in a different way. She could not control Henry's heart, but she could shape France's future through her sons. The experience of finally becoming a mother solidified Catherine's resilience. She had proven her doubters wrong. The woman once viewed as barren now stood as the mother of a dynasty. But she also knew that securing her position was only the beginning. Now, she had something far more important to protect than her marriage. She had a future to mold and a dynasty to defend. Navigating court politics. With the birth of her children and her growing role in royal affairs, Catherine began to truly insert herself into the intricate web of court politics. She was no longer content to simply observe from the shadows. While Henry still remained under Diane's spell, Catherine began forging her own network of alliances within the court. She aligned herself with moderate voices, religious advisors, foreign dignitaries, and even lesser nobles who owed her small favors. Quietly, she built a political foundation beneath the surface of court life. Her strategy was subtle but effective. While others sought power through loud declarations or public spectacle, Catherine used intelligence, timing, and an intimate knowledge of human nature. She listened more than she spoke. She studied motives, mapped relationships, and identified weak points in her rivals. When key decisions were being made, she ensured her voice was heard, even if it was through someone else's mouth. Influence did not always require visibility. Catherine also took an interest in the broader affairs of the kingdom. She sat in on council meetings, reviewed reports, and learned the mechanisms of governance. She educated herself in matters of finance, trade, religion, and law. Few noticed how much she absorbed, but in time, her understanding of the court would rival that of any seasoned advisor. She knew that if she were ever to rule in her own right, or protect her children's right to rule, she needed more than maternal instincts. She needed mastery. At the same time, Catherine had to be careful. Any misstep could be seen as overreach. France was still wary of Italian influence, and her family name did not always inspire trust. She made sure to move slowly, never taking too much credit, always allowing others to believe her actions served the greater good. But beneath her calm exterior, every alliance, every favor, every decision was carefully calculated. She was no longer the silent wife. She was becoming a queen in practice, if not yet in title. It was during these years that Catherine's political identity truly began to form. She had survived infertility, humiliation, and exile in her own home. Now, she was using the very court that had mocked her as the platform for her ascent. Though she still played second to Diane in Henry's eyes, she had begun to eclipse her in political relevance. Catherine was not just navigating court politics, she was preparing to master them. The pressure of royal duty. As her children grew and her involvement in the affairs of state deepened, Catherine came to understand the crushing weight of royal duty. She had fought for her position, secured heirs, and built alliances. But now, she was faced with the most painful and complex challenge of all, ensuring that her children would survive and thrive in a kingdom full of enemies. Every decision she made had consequences, not only for herself, but for the entire Valois dynasty. She began orchestrating marriages, securing alliances across Europe that would protect France's interests and reinforce her family's power. But these marriages often came at a cost. Her daughters were sent far from home, into foreign courts where they had little support. Her sons, though educated and trained, were vulnerable to court factions, religious fanatics, and ambitious nobles. Catherine bore the pain of watching her children enter these traps with a mother's fear and a ruler's resolve. Catherine made difficult choices, some of which would haunt her. She permitted compromises that went against her conscience. She overlooked injustices if it meant stability. In moments of crisis, she acted with ruthless precision, knowing that hesitation could mean disaster. Though she had once hoped to be loved, she now understood that to be respected or even feared was the only way to survive. Royalty demanded sacrifice, and Catherine offered it willingly. But the emotional toll was immense. Catherine lost several children young and suffered betrayals from within her own household. She endured rumors, revolts, and threats from factions that saw her as a foreign interloper. Through it all, she wore the crown with quiet determination, never showing weakness in public. Though privately, she carried the unbearable weight of grief, anxiety, and guilt. In the end, Catherine's dedication to duty transformed her from a sidelined queen into a central figure in France's most turbulent chapter. She had suffered deeply, sacrificed endlessly, and survived relentlessly. Her marriage had offered little warmth, but it gave her access to a throne she would never let go of. And though her journey had only begun, one thing had become clear. Catherine de' Medici would do whatever was necessary to protect her children's future, even if it cost her everything. Henry II's death in July 1559 changed everything for Catherine. It happened in the middle of public celebration, a jousting tournament marking the peace between France and Spain, and the marriage of her daughter Elizabeth. The king, dressed in gold and black, tilted against the young Gabriel de Montgomery, captain of his Scottish Guard. A splinter from Montgomery's lance pierced Henry's eye, and 10 agonizing days later, he was dead. Catherine, who had spent years living in the shadow of his mistress Diane de Poitiers, suddenly found herself free of that humiliation. But his death was not only a personal turning point, it was the beginning of her rise as a political force in France. When Francis II, her 15-year-old son, ascended the throne, the court immediately became a battleground. The powerful Guise family, uncles of the young Queen Mary Stuart, sought to control the boy king, while Protestant nobles whispered about rebellion. Catherine, underestimated for so long, saw her chance. She presented herself as a grieving widow and dutiful mother. But behind the veil of mourning, she began consolidating her influence. She had learned the mechanics of power through years of humiliation, and now she was ready to use them. It was not easy. Catherine's position as regent was not legally secure. She had to fight to be included in the king's council and to counteract the Guise brothers' influence. She built alliances with moderate Catholics and even some Protestants, positioning herself as a neutral mother figure rather than a partisan. She shifted appointments, controlled access to the king, and slowly wove a network of loyal advisors. Each move was deliberate, each word carefully chosen. The woman who once waited in the shadows now moved openly, her power growing with each royal decree signed in her son's name. When Francis II died the following year, and her 10-year-old son, Charles IX, became king, Catherine's regency was secure. She was now the unquestioned guardian of the crown. Though officially still only the Queen Mother, she directed policy, appointed ministers, and negotiated with foreign powers. She balanced the egos of nobles, bishops, and generals, all while keeping her children close. The Italian-born girl who had once been mocked as barren now ruled France in all but name. Catherine's rise after Henry's death marked the beginning of her true reign. The lessons of survival she had learned as a child and the patience she had cultivated as a humiliated wife were now her weapons. She had endured years of Diane de Poitiers' dominance, but with Henry gone, Diane was swiftly exiled, her property seized. Catherine reclaimed the crown jewels and moved into the Louvre. She had taken back her dignity and the reins of France. By the early 1570s, France was teetering on the edge of collapse. Years of religious war between Catholics and Huguenots had torn the kingdom apart. Catherine, ever the mediator, had spent years negotiating edicts of tolerance and arranging marriages to unite opposing factions. Her boldest attempt at peace came with the 1572 wedding of her daughter Margaret of Valois to Henry of Navarre, the Protestant prince who would one day become king. Paris was filled with Huguenot nobles who had come to celebrate. The wedding was supposed to heal France. Instead, it became the setting for one of the darkest events in French history. Days after the ceremony, an attempt was made on the life of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a leading Protestant. Panic spread. On the night of August 23, 1572, Catholic mobs, spurred on by militant leaders. The violence spiraled beyond anyone's control. Streets ran with blood. Bodies floated down the Seine. Within days, the massacre spread to other cities. Thousands of Huguenots were dead. Catherine's role in the massacre remains one of history's great controversies. Some chroniclers accused her of planning the killings from the start, portraying her as a Machiavellian architect of slaughter. Others argued she had tried to prevent a coup against her son and that the violence was an unintended escalation. Catherine herself never gave a clear explanation. She spoke of necessary measures, but her guarded words fueled suspicion. Whether she ordered it or not, the massacre forever stained her reputation. For Catherine, the massacre was a turning point. She had spent years trying to mediate between Catholics and Protestants. But after August 1572, her image as a peacemaker was destroyed. In Protestant Europe, she became the Black Queen, a figure of hatred and fear. Yet within France, many Catholics saw her as a savior who had crushed a potential rebellion. Her legacy was now as divided as the kingdom she ruled. The Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre showed the high stakes of Catherine's political game. Whether out of calculation or desperation, she had crossed a moral line. It was a moment when the personal and political fused. A mother protecting her son's throne, a regent struggling to hold a country together, and a queen willing to pay the price of blood for survival. Before and after the massacre, Catherine continued to navigate the treacherous waters of France's religious wars. She saw clearly that fanaticism on either side, Catholic or Protestant, posed an existential threat to the monarchy. Her policy was never driven by theology, it was driven by survival. She issued edicts granting limited tolerance to Protestants, then retracted them under pressure from Catholic factions. She called for peace conferences, only to watch them dissolve into violence. Her strategy was flexibility, shifting as the tides of power shifted. Marriage was one of Catherine's sharpest tools. She brokered unions that would bind potential rivals to the crown. Her daughter Elizabeth's marriage to Philip II of Spain reinforced Catholic ties. Margaret's marriage to Henry of Navarre, though disastrous at first, ultimately linked the Valois and Bourbon houses. Each wedding was a chess move designed to buy the crown time and space to survive. But peace was always temporary. Skirmishes flared into wars. Treaties broke down. Catherine's sons, especially Charles IX, lacked the decisiveness to enforce policy, leaving their mother to act as the kingdom's steady hand. She met with generals, negotiated with foreign ambassadors, and traveled across provinces to keep the fragile state intact. Even her enemies admitted her stamina was extraordinary. Catherine's religious policies were inconsistent by design. She was not a zealot. She did not seek to eradicate Protestantism, but neither could she openly defy the Catholic majority. Her goal was equilibrium, not victory. In this, she was ahead of her time, a secular ruler in an age of holy wars. But her pragmatism won her few friends. To Catholics, she was too lenient. To Protestants, she was a murderer. These years of turmoil cemented Catherine's reputation as the true power behind the French throne. She was no longer the silent queen of Henry II. She was the mediator, the strategist, the Black Queen of France, who moved between factions with the precision of a master player. Catherine's greatest challenge was not the nobles or the religious wars. It was her own family. She was the mother of three kings, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, and each presented unique problems. Francis was frail and easily manipulated by the Guise family. Charles was emotionally unstable, prone to fits of rage and indecision. Henry, her favorite, was intelligent but theatrical, more interested in pageantry than policy. Catherine tried to guide them all, but her influence had limits. She acted as advisor, tutor, and sometimes commander, drafting letters in their names and dictating policies. In private, she scolded and pleaded. In public, she projected unity. But the tension between motherly love and political necessity often tore at her. She arranged marriages for her sons and daughters to secure alliances, even when it meant sending them into unhappy unions or dangerous courts. Her maternal instinct and political ambition were two sides of the same coin. Her relationship with her daughter Margaret of Valois was particularly stormy. Margaret resisted Catherine's control, openly defying her at court and in her marriage to Henry of Navarre. Their clashes became public spectacles, undermining Catherine's carefully cultivated image of unity. Yet Catherine never gave up trying to pull her children back into her orbit. She saw them not just as individuals, but as pieces on a chessboard she had to keep in play. These familial conflicts reflected the larger chaos of the kingdom. Catherine was fighting on two fronts, against rebellious nobles and against rebellious children. She could command armies, negotiate treaties, and outmaneuver rivals. But she could not always control her own blood. This reality weighed heavily on her, deepening the lines on her face and hardening her resolve. Managing her children showed Catherine at her most complex. She was neither the heartless manipulator her enemies accused her of being, nor the saintly mother her allies praised. She was both, sometimes in the same moment. She loved her children, but she also used them. She guided them, but she also sacrificed their happiness for the survival of the crown. By the 1580s, the Valois dynasty Catherine had fought so hard to preserve was crumbling. Henry III, the last of her sons to rule, alienated both Catholic and Protestant factions. The Catholic League, led by the powerful Guise family, threatened open rebellion. The Protestant faction, led by Henry of Navarre, Catherine's own son-in-law, prepared for war. France was again on the brink. Catherine, aging and exhausted, continued to mediate, traveling across France to negotiate peace. But her influence was waning. She still counseled Henry III, but the king's erratic decisions and reliance on controversial favorites undermined her efforts. Even as she worked to hold the monarchy together, she could see that the dynasty's end was near. Catherine de' Medici's life as a mother was just as complicated as her role as queen. She loved her children deeply and wanted the best for them, but being a queen meant balancing love with politics. Her sons, as they grew older, started to demand their own space, their own decisions, and Catherine had to adjust. She had spent years preparing them for the throne, but now, as they were becoming rulers in their own right, Catherine faced the difficult reality that her control over their futures was no longer absolute. Charles IX, her second son, was crowned king at a young age, and he was very much influenced by his mother's guidance. But as he grew older, his personal insecurities became more apparent. Catherine's protective instincts clashed with Charles's increasing desire for independence. His emotional fragility made him easy to manipulate, and Catherine often found herself picking up the pieces of his reign, holding together what she could. But even Charles, though deeply dependent on his mother, started to drift away. His reign was marked by religious wars and violence, and Catherine couldn't always protect him from the pressures of being king. Then there was Henry III, her third son, who also became king after Charles's death. Unlike Charles, Henry was more politically aware, but his weakness lay in his emotional instability. Catherine had high hopes for him, but as his reign progressed, she watched as he struggled to balance the Catholic factions and the growing Protestant movement. Her maternal instincts pushed her to keep him safe, to shield him from the pressures of the throne. But Catherine soon realized that even her guidance couldn't save him from his own doubts. Through all of this, Catherine had to constantly adjust. She was both a mother and a political player, constantly shifting between the two roles, trying to protect her sons while making sure they didn't fail in their responsibilities as kings. But the deeper she got into politics, the harder it became to keep that balance. Her children's growth and ambitions started to pull them away from her influence, and the mother who once shaped their destinies now found herself helpless at times, unable to control their paths. Catherine's role as a mother wasn't just about love, it was about survival. She had spent her life making sure her sons would be strong enough to rule, but in doing so, she had lost parts of herself. She had been so focused on securing their futures that she sometimes lost sight of their personal struggles. And when those struggles came to the surface, Catherine was left to watch, heartbroken as the family she fought for began to unravel. When Charles IX died unexpectedly in 1574, Catherine was left shattered. Charles, who had been a sensitive and insecure king, had always relied on her guidance. His sudden death felt like the end of an era for Catherine, not just as a mother, but as a queen. For years, she had fought to protect him and ensure his reign, but now she had lost her second son. Her grief was overwhelming, and the weight of the crown became even heavier. Catherine's personal pain was deeply intertwined with the loss of the Valois dynasty's strength. Charles's death left her with another son to protect. But Henry III, the new king, was not the strong ruler Catherine had hoped for. Despite being crowned, Henry was constantly caught between rival factions, unable to command the loyalty of the court. Catherine, once a powerful figure in French politics, watched helplessly as the kingdom began to crumble. Her son was king, but in many ways, Catherine was still running the show, though it had become clear that the weight of ruling was taking a toll on both mother and son. The emotional toll on Catherine during this period was immense. Her maternal instinct told her to protect her remaining children, but politically, she was forced to act in ways that were cold and calculated. Henry's reign was marked by constant struggles, and Catherine found herself unable to shield him from the inevitable failures that came with ruling a fractured kingdom. She began to feel the burden of both her political ambitions and the painful reality that her family could not live up to the expectations she had set for them. The kingdom was on the verge of collapse, and Catherine was caught between trying to maintain control and dealing with the grief of losing her beloved son. As Henry's reign continued, the political landscape only grew more complicated. Catherine's role was now less about providing guidance, and more about trying to hold together a kingdom that was falling apart. The death of Charles had left a hole in the Valois family that Catherine couldn't fill. Her hopes for a stable France, led by her children, were slipping away. And no matter how hard she tried, Catherine could not protect them from the dangers of power. The decline of the Valois dynasty was inevitable, and as Catherine grew older, she found herself facing the reality of her family's faltering power. The once mighty dynasty that she had fought to protect for so many years was slipping through her fingers. With Charles's death and Henry's inability to effectively rule, Catherine's hopes for the future of her family were quickly fading. The court, once a place where Catherine had maneuvered with skill and precision, now seemed like a chaotic battlefield. Political factions were at each other's throats, and Catherine, despite her many years of experience, struggled to control the forces at play. Her children, who had been the center of her efforts to secure the throne, were now a source of frustration. Charles was dead, Henry was weak, and her other children were not in a position to lead. The Valois family was fractured, and Catherine found herself fighting to keep it together, even as the dynasty seemed on the brink of collapse. Catherine's once unshakable resolve was now tested to its limits. Her health was declining, and the weight of her years of sacrifice and political struggle began to show. The kingdom she had worked so hard to protect was no longer in her hands. The years of ruthless political maneuvers, the bloodshed, and the constant pressure of court politics had taken their toll. Catherine was no longer the queen who could maneuver through every challenge with ease. She was now a mother, an aging queen, watching as her family's legacy unraveled. Yet, even in her decline, Catherine was unwilling to give up. She continued to plot and maneuver, hoping for one last chance to secure her family's future. But the forces against her were too great. The Valois dynasty, once so powerful, was slowly dying, and no amount of political skill could save it. Catherine's heart ached for her children and for the kingdom she had worked so tirelessly to protect. In the end, her efforts were not enough to stop the inevitable fall of the Valois dynasty. The assassination of the Duke of Guise in 1588 was another dramatic moment in Catherine's reign. Guise, leader of the Catholic League, had become a powerful rival to Henry III. His increasing influence threatened the monarchy, and Catherine, who had spent her life navigating the complex web of political power, had to make a difficult decision. When Henry III ordered Guise's assassination, it was a political maneuver meant to weaken the Catholic League and secure the throne for the Valois family. But the act only increased instability in France, highlighting Catherine's inability to control the forces at court. The assassination deepened the rift between Catherine and her son, Henry III, who was already struggling to maintain control. Catherine had once been able to manipulate events to her advantage, but now she found herself unable to steer the course of history. The Duke's murder exposed the vulnerability of the monarchy, and the political chaos that followed made it clear that Catherine's reign was nearing its end. Catherine de' Medici's death in 1589 marked the end of an era. She had spent her entire life navigating the dangerous world of French politics, fighting for her family's survival and the future of the Valois dynasty. But as she lay on her deathbed, it was clear that the dynasty she had worked so hard to protect was in decline. Her sons had failed to secure the throne, and the forces of rebellion and factionalism had torn France apart. Catherine's death brought the end of the Valois line, and with it, the end of an era of political maneuvering that had defined her reign. As she passed, Catherine must have reflected on the choices she had made, the sacrifices she had endured. Had it all been worth it? Had the power, the alliances, the bloodshed been enough to secure her family's legacy? In her final moments, Catherine likely saw the kingdom she had fought for slipping away, and perhaps wondered whether her efforts had ultimately been in vain. Catherine's legacy, though complex, is one of both power and tragedy. She was a queen who navigated one of the most tumultuous periods in French history, but her success came at a great personal cost. Her ambition for her family's survival often clashed with her role as a mother, and her efforts to secure the throne ultimately led to the fall of the Valois dynasty. Catherine de' Medici will forever be remembered as a political genius, but also as a mother who struggled to protect her children, and a queen whose reign was defined by both triumphs and failure.